Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from a cold but sunny Washington, D.C. It is the afternoon of March 10th, 2017, and we are in the midst of an epic battle. This is, in many ways, the first set-piece engagement of this entire new administration, because we're dealing with something which has not been attempted so far, and that is, of course, on the one hand, to strip the American people of an economic right which they have attained after a long period of time. It is tantamount to repealing parts of the Bill of Rights. As remember, when Franklin D. Roosevelt came forward with his 8-point economic Bill of Rights in January 1944, saying if you defeat the dictators, American people, here's what you deserve to get. And he wanted those anchored in the Constitution. That would have those were rights, and one of the rights was the right to adequate health care. But now we have the Republicans drunk with the ideology of the John Birch Society, right, which used to be a punchline in songs decades ago. We've got the Austrian school. Well, they weren't too many of those founding fathers who adhered to the Austrian school. And we've got Milton Friedman's Chicago boy monetarism, such a great success in Chile that we have to bring it home here again. We've got the classic business ideology of the Chamber of Commerce and so forth. And given that mentality, those are the cardinal points for somebody like Paul Ryan, coming from John Birch Society country, as he does. Those are the ideas that are guiding the Republicans as they seek to strip you of 3 entitlements, not even 1, but 3. Obamacare can be considered as an entitlement because it says that if you meet certain criteria, you have a right to buy this coverage, and you can't be prevented because of a pre-existing condition and other benefits, right? You can't be denied because there's a cap and that your life has somehow become too expensive, right? There's no yearly cap. There's no lifetime cap. Let's see what happens with this bill that the Republicans say they have. And then, of course, you've got Medicaid, which is that if you're below the poverty line or thereabouts, you have a right to participate in Medicaid. And with that, you have the ability to get some health care that otherwise you wouldn't get. And, of course, the plan from the Republicans is to take away that entitlement so that if there's money, then maybe you'll get something. But if there's no money, you can simply be turned away. And then, very sinister and not widely recognized, the current AHCA, the American Health Care Act, which is really, it's not American, it's the anti-American Health Care Act. And of course it has very little to do with health care. It's actually a plan for tax cuts for the rich. $350 billion over 10 years flow into the pockets of the fat cats, the predators, the speculators, the top 1% or even some fraction of that. And then, of course, there are about 20 other taxes that are repealed. But the really big one is about $35 billion a year. It's a surtax of approximately 5% on these top incomes, way over $250,000 a year. And naturally, those legions of greed have been chafing all these years. And naturally, they say, the public be damned. You can go drop dead. And this, we had an explicit pledge from the current tenant of the White House that people would not be succumbing in the streets to lack of health care. So all of this grist for the political mill. So remember, Obamacare goes down, Medicaid goes down, and Medicare goes down. And what does that leave you then? It leaves you really nothing but your eyes to cry with. And why do you have to do this? Because it's not affordable? Well, a Wall Street sales tax of 1% on all transactions, including derivatives, would go far. And, of course, making Wall Street pay any kind of taxes, right? Not negative taxes, the way General Electric often has, where they get paid by the federal government, or a tax rate in the low single digits, which has been typical of Goldman Sachs. And I'm sure they'll go on with that because they've got 6 representatives at high levels in this administration. But there's a political and moral and historical question, too, I would suggest. And it goes something like this. Up to now, we've had, of course, histrionics, right? We've had all kinds of posturing. We've had tweets. We've had campaigns against individuals. We've had feuds. We've had the bewildering, dizzying array of intersubjective conflicts and what have you. And then, of course, those have been followed after January 20th by a series of executive orders, and some of those have fared poorly, right? The executive order banning immigration and refugees from the 7 countries, permanently banning refugees from Syria and things of this sort, that has been essentially frozen, if not completely struck down, because it never got that far, but frozen in the federal court system, and that there's now an attempt, right, to launch the second version of that, right, the travel ban or anti-Muslim ban 2.0, and that is also under attack. What do we have? Hawaii has its own suit, and then separate from that, we have the state of Washington, joined by New York, Minnesota, and Oregon, I think. So there are going to be plenty of state attorneys general, right? Indeed, if you're a state attorney general, you better get a suit going, because otherwise you're not going to have much of a career. Either you're going to be able to campaign, if you're elected, that you did do these things, or your opponent is going to say, why didn't you? And get out of the way, because you're going to find an opponent who will. So that all goes on, right? So we've had rule by decree, right? Increase the interest rate on FHA, Federal Housing Administration mortgages by 1/4 of 1%. That was the first thing in the first hour of the new administration on the afternoon of January 20th. We've had all kinds of decrees about suspending different protections for people who want to use various bathrooms, things of this sort, right? All kinds of executive orders. So we've had this interlude of rule by decree, and that has somehow gotten bogged down. It's gotten bogged down because there still is a court system. There still is public opinion. They still have the media. We still have the Congress. So we do have various forms of checks and balances. But now we come to actual legislation. We come to making a law. And this, of course, involves the Congress. And it involves the fact that there are not only 2 parties plus some independents, but there are 2 houses, and they have different rules, and they proceed according to different schedules. Their elections are different, right? They march to the beat of a different drummer from time to time. And we now enter the area of binding action, because in the area of the histrionics and the posturing, well, you can say whatever you want, right? You take the consequences in terms of public opinion, but you can say whatever you want, sure. You have the First Amendment too, so say it. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. Now remember, from Monday through Thursday, you got to keep up. Things are moving really fast. You must keep up. And we can do a whole lot more with an hour a day, supplementing now the 80 or so minutes of broadcasting that we have here on taped on Friday, broadcast starting on Saturday. So that means go to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv, and keep up with everything that's happening. So that's available Monday through Thursday. Please go there. It's a nominal fee, a couple of cappuccino, frappuccino, and you have it. It's a much better deal than public radio, and because they're having their fund drive this week, last week, 50 cents a show. I think pretty good deal because it's different. Whatever it is, it's different. So now we're entering the area of binding actions, things that cannot be washed away by contradictory statements. In other words, once you say Obamacare is hereby repealed and you are hereby stripped of your ability to go to the doctor, and you have that on the 67 pages or whatever it is that we're supposed to admire because it's so concise. I'd rather have a longer one that gave me more benefits, frankly. If they're listing my benefits, I don't want it to be short. I want it to be long because I want lots of benefits, lots and lots of pages, each one filled with good benefits. Well, there's where we are with that. But if you're going to have it written down, then that means it sticks. It's permanent, and you're held responsible. And you can't simply say, no, I never said that, or you can't simply flip-flop the next day. So we're getting to a point of binding action, irrevocable action in many ways. Things that you can't even kid yourself you can change. And there's the big problem of the people who voted for this. And maybe these people are not the swiftest when it comes to understanding what's going on. Right? Generally speaking, they're not the most astute, frankly. A lot of them had hope, but we have all these really tragic cases now. The media are filling up with tragic cases, right, from Kentucky to West Virginia to Texas to all over the place. People who voted for this administration and thought they would make Obamacare better. And, of course, they were loudly proclaiming that they would repeal Obamacare, root and branch, and then replace it with something terrific. Well, I'm sorry, if you believe this, you really have to ask yourself if it's not time to become a little bit more astute, if we can say so. Because people are now finding that they're being deprived, or they will be deprived, or may be deprived of their health care. Now, it's not too late. I would say to those people, right, don't sit at home nursing grievance, right? Don't get angry with me because I say some of these things. But rather, figure that you want to reverse your field, right? You want to change the way you look at these things. The big question is, there are lots and lots of rural people that we've never forgotten here, right? We've always had a job program for rural America. It's part of that 10 million government job, government promoted, right? WPA, PWA job program, which we've always advocated, right? Which is for people who are not in the labor force, maybe have not been lately, need training or something, and they can find employment that way. So 30 million in infrastructure financed by the Fed, 0% 100-year bonds in many cases. And then you've also got this thing about the 10 million young people, either inner city ghetto victims or people in rural America in depressed areas who need a specifically government-sponsored job program. Those where the government is actually providing the work. The other one is generally states, private contractors with the financing coming from the Fed. Rural America, Appalachia, very typical, right? And Appalachia is a big thing, right? It cuts quite a swath, right? Goes up into New England, goes way down into the Ozarks, and right? I'm talking about greater Appalachia. And elderly people, right? A lot of elderly people, elderly white people who somehow fell prey to cultural populism and thought this was a good thing, or they went along with it because of the herd instinct, because their friends were doing it, or their community. Anyway, are those people going to be rewarded for their vote, or are they going to be punished? And if they're punished, how long will it take them to figure out what has occurred? So those are very, very interesting political questions. The other part is the Republican Party. Now, the Republican Party has not held the presidency for 8 years. And before that, with George W. Bush, that was one of the most catastrophic presidencies in all of U.S. history. In other words, the ability of George W. Bush in 2007 and 2008 to combine a war in Iraq, which was going very poorly, racking up lots of casualties and very little to show for it, and an economic breakdown crisis triggered by the Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, derivatives crisis, right, spreading around the world to Northern Rock and Royal Bank of Scotland. It was the whole Anglo-American banking system blowing up. In those days, we could say, back in those days of Abramoff and his corruption, or back in the days of Mark Foley and his moral turpitude, I guess many Republicans would say, that the Republicans were really not a party of government. They could not govern. And the big question now is what they have to show us, if they can, is that they can govern. And govern means govern. It means not posture with ideology, not read teleprompters, not engage in feuds with various celebrities, superannuated or otherwise, but to govern, right? In other words, to start solving the vital problems that face working families. Are you acting out an obsessive ideology, or are you actually solving real-world problems? And my estimate is they can't govern, that they are the party of ungovernability. They're the party of chaos, because they've got this backward Tea Party caucus, right, the 40 or 50 people in that group, right? We've mentioned the leaders of that. You've got Bratt, you've got Meadows, you've got Jordan, you've got Louis Gohmert, you got a bunch of these other people, right? They're very backward people. And they, I'm sure they're sincerely bewildered by the modern world, and they really don't know what to do, and they don't like things that are complicated, and they want everything simple. And somehow they've gotten themselves into this. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. We're going to have the Ides of March this coming week, and we're got to be aware of that. We've got to be aware of the possible beginning of a slow motion debt ceiling crisis. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But right now, we have this Republican bill, right, the AHCA. We have Ryan, who comes out, and we should take seriously some of these things. Ryan did a sort of a news conference on yesterday, 23-minute slideshow. He says, we have a binary choice. You can either vote for the House bill or Obamacare, the ACA, Affordable Care Act, will survive. We as Republicans have been waiting 7 years to do this. He says, this is the closest we will ever get to repealing and replacing Obamacare. The time is here. The time is now. This is the moment. Now, that may be a realistic evaluation. In other words, this Republican majority, in my view, is not going to last long. You can see that it's getting long in the tooth. And the Republican majority is a frontal attack on the economic, cultural, social, moral interests of so much of the American people. The vast majority, I would say, right? In other words, who wants this stuff that they're doing, right? What is it about Obamacare that they find so objectionable, right? We've sort of lost that as the time has gone on. But he's right. His window will not go on forever. Either some catastrophic event, right, a financial crisis, the bottom falls out of the stock market, any number of other factors can essentially freeze this repeal process, right, as the Democrats found, right? You think you've got at least 2 years. You may not even have 2 years. And more than 2 years, I don't think they have. And notice, he says the closest we'll ever get to repealing. In other words, he's saying we can't really repeal the whole thing. We can't restore pre-existing conditions. We can't say that kids have to get off their parents' policies. We can't reimpose these caps on lifetime and individual yearly expenses. We can't do that. It just won't fly. The traffic won't bear it. So we got to do as much as we can. We got to do as much damage as we can, says Ryan, the ideologue. Take that seriously. The demonstrations, especially at the town meetings, but the 5.5 million, and I want to insist on 5.5 million Americans in the streets on the 21st of January, joined by 500,000 overseas, notably 100,000 in London. Those have had some effect. There is nervousness in the ranks of these Republicans, right? These ideologues, the hardliners in particular. So it's a binary choice. He says you got to take this or you're going to keep the status quo. Well, at that rate, the lesser evil is the status quo. It's not my program. My program is Medicare for all, paid for by Wall Street, through a Wall Street sales tax and through an enforcement of the 35% federal corporate income tax, which these guys don't pay. They claim they pay 35, but they don't. They pay much, much less, and some of them get paid. So that's the way Ryan portrays it. Now, the amazing thing is I have never seen a bill get such a negative rejection as a reception. This AHCA, right? We've gone through this. We can't go through all the details on the weekend program here because we've already done it during the week. But suffice it to say, and we'll try to explore this from a certain point of view. It's going to mean 10, 15, 20 million people lose coverage. Depends on how far out you project it. And it means that they'll pay more, and the coverage they get, the treatment they get, will be inferior. And that's the long and the short of it. And it's been broadly rejected. Look, who doesn't like it? Who does? Better you should ask who does like it. The AARP, okay, Senior Citizens and Retirees. American Association of Retired Persons, no, they don't want it. American Medical Association, the physicians, no, they don't want it. The American Hospital Association, the hospitals, they don't like it either. The AHCA, these are the nursing homes, they don't like it. The American College of Physicians, no, they don't like it. National Nurses United, there's more than one nurses union, and both of them or all of them seem to be united, the main ones, in rejecting this thing. Now, the thing that makes it really bad is where is this heading? And here we have to thank a guy called Slavitt, I think his name is, and I think Slavitt has earned a vote of thanks because he's sounding the alarm, I think, in a timely way. Because what he's saying is what I said at the beginning, that this is not just the beginning of the end of the Obamacare entitlement, but it goes further. It leads to the abolition of other existing rights, I think, in an absolutely tragic and unacceptable way. So what does Slavitt say? Here, first of all, it talks about wealth redistribution. So here's an article in the Washington Post by Karen Tumulty. Wealth redistribution in the AHCA. Now, the Republicans have been screaming wealth redistribution, that their legions of greed were getting looted so that poor people could get something. This is the opposite, and this is Slavitt. Slavitt is the former head. He's Andy Slavitt. He was the acting administrator of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services during the end of the Obama years. So it's about $1 trillion that he was, or more, that he was controlling. He says, this is a big transfer, the Republican bill. This is a massive tax cut for unpopular industries, insurance companies, and wealthy individuals, the 1%, the 1/10 of 1%, the predators. It is about cutting care for lower income people, seniors, people with disabilities, and kids to pay for the tax cut, the $35 billion a year, and then take it from there. Not only is it $35 billion a year, but it makes it easier for insurance companies to pay their executives more than $500,000 a year. So it's a kind of a benefit program for the bosses of these insurance companies. And we know what they've been doing. They've been saying, hey, federal government, you let us merge or we're going to drop out of these exchanges, right? I want to repeat my call, right? If the president calls in business executives and jawbones them and he says, get your factory back to the United States, I would say another thing you might be able to do is to call in some insurance companies and say, get yourself back into those exchanges. If there are counties in Tennessee that have no choices, you get in there. You, big insurance, big medical, big pharma, whatever they are. Get yourself in there and help the American people, because if you turn your back on the American people, they will turn their back on you. So, but now Slavitt also has today, he's 2 for 2 here, earlier in the week on Wednesday, Washington Post. So Slavitt is telling you that the most lasting effects of this bill would be the significant steps towards forcing permanent changes to Medicaid and Medicare. Medicaid ones are more obvious and more dangerous. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So we're following interesting warning from Andy Slavitt, who was the administrator for Medicare-Medicaid. He was a single payer for those areas. So the idea is that Medicaid and Medicare are targeted. Medicaid most obviously. We had a big expansion of Medicaid. It meant that people a little bit above the poverty line, I think from 100% of poverty to 138% of poverty, a little bit above, they're able to buy Medicaid now. And the states were cajoled into doing that, even Republican states, because the federal government offered to help pay for it. Well, this has brought health care to lots of people, right? The growth in these places like West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, the top 5 states in the Medicaid expansion, they all voted for Trump, by the way. So you tell me if that's enlightened self-interest. It's obviously not. But even so, we don't want to punish them, do we? We want to try to save their health care too, because that's the national interest, which has to rule over these things. So anyway, the idea is that expansion will no longer be funded. And when it's no longer funded, it's going to collapse, because most of these states just don't have the money. They need the federal dollars, and by God, they should get them. Taking away the funding is the same thing as abolishing the program, as he says, right? It'll wither on the vine, as Newt Gingrich would always say. A more draconian one is the permanent capping of the Medicaid program. What do you do if Zika comes along? What do you do if there are high-cost drugs, right, like the hepatitis C drugs and similar things like that? Suppose your national opioid epidemic goes further. Under the changes sought by the Republicans, says Slavitt, states would no longer have the resources to manage these crises. Medicaid pays for nearly half the births. Half the babies born are born on Medicare. Medicaid, and half the long-term care in this country is from Medicaid, to say nothing of the millions of Americans with disabilities who rely on it. If the federal government retreats in its commitment to Medicaid, the repercussions will be felt quickly by our neighbors and by our care providers and hospitals. Now, there is an emergency fund. Here we go. It's called the Prevention and Public Health Fund. In any given year, it provides $1 billion with a B to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to fight things like bioterrorism, epidemics, disease outbreaks, immunization, heart disease screenings, other kinds of screenings. This is going to be eliminated. It's just going to disappear. And that's a supplementary thing to Slavitt's argument. You can read about that in the Thursday, March 9th, Washington Post. Now, the bill, the one that Ryan says is so important to pass. This bill will cut several years from the life of the Medicare Trust Fund. But that's no accident. This would put Medicare right where the entitlement hawks, the austerity ghouls, the people who want to strip you of your rights, people like House Speaker Paul Ryan, puts it right where they want it, in crisis. If this bill became law, the Speaker would finally be positioned to change Medicare into a voucher program. Because this bill would reduce coverage and make insurance less affordable, the only way for Republicans to sell it has been to feign a collapse or implosion of the Affordable Care Act. It is simply false. As independent analysts such as Standard & Poor's have reported, there have been rate increases, but then the exchanges have been stable until the current administration came along and started with this apocalyptic death spiral rhetoric, which they've been using, and that facilitates, of course, these for-profit companies with unscrupulous, predatory executives thinking about their golden parachutes who say they want to leave. All of this serves the real objective, which is to use the so-called rescue, the rescue of the individual market, to make permanent draconian changes to Medicare and Medicaid, to cut them savagely, and to push towards a major tax cut for high-income earners, insurers, tanning salons. I guess tanning salons are now a vital strategic interest, and pharmaceutical companies. They are the beneficiaries. Some think that's a good idea, but it can hardly be defended. So that is Slavitt. So therefore, what's going to happen? As I said, all of those different groups, the ones we went through, right? The entire civil society. The civil society is against it, by and large. But then we've also got, we have the Tuesday Club in the Congress and the House of Representatives, the Republican Tuesday Club. They're very worried that if this gets any worse, it's going to be political harry-kiri for them to vote for it. And over there in the Senate, we got Susan Collins, liberal Republican. She says it can't pass the Senate. Now we've got Tom Cotton. This is interesting. This is somebody who wants to have a great future, right? He probably wants to be president. So he says this bill can't pass the Senate, and we should start over. Cancel this, Ryan, says Senator Tom Cotton. Cancel this and start over. And I'm thinking, his eyes were open. The scales fell off his eyes when he was confronted by that extremely vocal and militant bunch of Arkansans there in that big auditorium that was full. So those are people, the liberal Republicans and the right-wingers, but also, again, people who don't want to end their political careers now for the sake of the John Birch Society's ideology. We've also got Portman of Ohio, Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia, Gardner of Colorado, Murkowski of Alaska. Those are four Republican senators who say we got to watch out with this. It can't be so draconian. So you can add Cotton. So what do we got so far? We've actually got about 6 Republican senators who have severe questions. Now, these Republican congressmen have to ask themselves, you are not going to be asked, were you a great defender of right-wing ideology, Austrian Chicago, Chamber of Commerce, Buckleyite, forget all that. The question your voters are going to have is, did you defend our economic rights? Did you keep the health care that we had won over all those years? So that's going to be the question. Now, the White House goal, of course, again, very bad idea to dive into this, right? Very bad idea to endorse this bill, to buy a pig in a poke, as far as I can see. Sight unseen. Eventually they'll read it. But the stuff about the collapse, the death spiral, the implosion is a big lie. New York Times has a good article about the areas where these significant premium increases have occurred. It's about 3 or 4% of the system, as I read the article. So this is completely overdone. This is Chicken Little and the sky is falling, scare tactics. We know it, right? It's like saying Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction in the east, west, north, and the south. That's the same speed as saying that Obamacare is collapsing. Now, of course, the leftists ought to search their consciences. We just had the Day Without a Woman. We devoted a lot of attention to this on the Monday through Thursday American System show. The people who organized this Day Without a Woman needed to say, save our health care, Medicare for all, or if that was too much, I understand people have not been educated. We had to make it mean something. Welcome to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C. So, the bottom line on the AHCA, the Ryan Bill, the American Health Care Act, the word goes out to every member of the House of Representatives and the Senate, vote no on this turkey. Vote no. The White House, of course, wants something they can call a win. Can we venture the guess that they're concerned about their own prestige and public relations? But for the people who are going to lose their health care, that is not enough. The president has to consider the general welfare, and that same goes for the members of the House of Representatives. The general welfare, by the way, for those of you who don't know, far from being a communist slogan left over from the Russian Revolution of 100 years ago. No, the general welfare is part of the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. And whenever you meet a reactionary, they'll always say, I'll tell you what that doesn't mean. Doesn't mean you should be on welfare. Yeah, fine, we got that. Tell us what it does mean. Tell us what it does mean. And it means that government policies have to help the broad prosperity of the entire population. So in that vein, let's take a look now at this infrastructure issue. We had some stuff going on this week. The previous week in the Tuesday speech, right, the Tuesday speech, the more or less composed one, before the Sessions issue began to emerge, we had a mention about infrastructure and a reiteration of the plan to spend about $1 trillion or to mobilize resources in the amount of $1 trillion over 10 years, 10 years. Because these are, it's obviously going to come from public-private partnerships. So maybe the federal government puts in half and the private interests put in half. But guess what? The private interests collect the exorbitant tolls on you. And you go back to a medieval system where you are essentially, they hold you up by your legs and let the money fall out of your pocket when you pass the toll gate. So that has led to some interest. Now, let me just point out, in the Senate Appropriations Committee, this is where the money is actually spent, right? Remember, everything's got to be approved twice. It's got to be authorized, got to be appropriated. Now we're into the second area here. The Subcommittee on Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development and Related Agencies, on Wednesday of this past week, Wednesday, March 8th, they had a hearing under the chairmanship of Senator Susan Collins, liberal Republican from Maine. So be careful. And a bunch of witnesses. These were the commissioner of the Maine Department of Transportation, the chief operating officer of the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, the president of the Association of American Airport Executives, the executive director of the Transportation Infrastructure Department at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, right? Austerity, no mandated benefits. The senior policy advisor of transportation for America. And this was, as far as I can see, ideas, no money committed. All right, so fine. But ultimately it's not fine because you're going to have to do some of this stuff. For example, I'm getting ahead of my argument here a little bit, but the American Society of Civil Engineers this past week has issued, actually yesterday or the day before, issued their report card on U.S. infrastructure. And according to that report card, it's a D+. And in particular, these airport guys would have to know, according to the American Society of Civil Engineers, in the 2017 report card on the U.S. infrastructure, on airports in particular, they say that airports will have a funding gap, a deficit, of $42 billion by the year 2025. And they say that these airports are overloaded. This is a gem out of this report. Airport congestion is getting worse every day. The American Society of Civil Engineers expects 24 of the 30 largest airports could soon experience what they call Thanksgiving peak traffic volume. In other words, the Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving, maybe the biggest travel day of the year. They're going to start having that one day a week. So they claim that runways are okay. I hope so. But the ability to handle passengers, cargo security, and other functions under the impact of crowding, this is still continuing to deteriorate. Now, there are some interesting calculations here from the engineers. Trump says $1 trillion, and at least half of that is public, private, right? Half public, half private, more or less, and maybe even less than that is public. But according to the engineers, we should be talking about $4.6 trillion with a T. $4.6 trillion. And the $4.6 trillion is, that's what you would need to go from a D+ national infrastructure to a B, not even an A, but a B. You would need $4.6 trillion. Now, I want to point out with pride that the Tax Wall Street Party has been advancing the demand now for the last several years that we get a financing of $5 trillion from the Federal Reserve, not from China borrowing, not from taxing working people through something like the gasoline tax. Forget those regressive taxes. Forget looting of working people to make this stuff go. Forget tolls. That defeats the purpose of the entire thing. They do not increase the productivity of labor. And lo and behold, here come the American Society of Civil Engineers and validate our figures practically, within a very narrow margin. 4.6 trillion, they say. And I guarantee you, when you get done with all this, since it can't be done instantaneously, there'll be enough inflation in there to change it to something that looks very much like $5 trillion. So the engineers are saying, back in 2001, they were saying 1.3 trillion. And now that's totally inadequate. Their report is issued every 4 years. So now we have a D+, and only incremental progress has been made over the last 4 years. Now, the engineers say Congress should raise the federal gas tax by 25 cents and index that to inflation. 25 cents a gallon No, thank you. We want the architects of the crisis to pay for the crisis. Those responsible are going to be left holding the bag. This is mainly two things. The Federal Reserve must provide boxcar financing. That is to say, they got to stand ready to buy 0% 100-year bonds in the amount of $5 trillion. They got to make a tender offer and then let the states, the counties, the cities, the regional authorities, Port Authority, New York, New Jersey, all these, and new authorities like the Transcontinental Maglev Authority and the Nawapa Authority, right, the water questions in the Great Basin. That's all got to be done through the Federal Reserve, plus a 1% Wall Street sales tax. So forget about the gas tax. That's the kiss of death. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So we're discussing infrastructure. The principal imperative is $5 trillion in credit made available, credit creation for job creation, using the credit creating resources of the U.S. economy and the productive power of the American people. $5 trillion, please. 0% interest, 100-year maturities. You do that, you'll surpass 2 or 3% growth. You'll be headed towards something much more dynamic than that. Now, in addition to the hearings that were held this week, we did have this confab at the White House. So Trump met with Elon Musk of Tesla. They also invited here Vornado Realty Trust, Steve Roth, Apollo Global Management, Josh Harris, developer Richard Lefrak, who I think calls himself Lefrak these days, and a few others. Let's just see who. U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Edward Mortimer. He was also at that hearing that we just mentioned. And Mike Pence, Elaine Chao, Energy Department, Scott Pruitt, and Bill Ford, General Atlantic CEO, McKinsey and Company partner Tyler Duval, Nature Conservancy Managing Director Lynn Scarlett. So what you see is it's essentially bankers, right, financiers, and people in the real estate game. And so I think the idea is some of this stuff is looked at as a way to increase property value, which is fine, but that can't be the guiding philosophy. And out of this whole thing, as far as we can tell, the idea is to renovate what exists. Fix it first. In other words, take the old stuff and fix it. Some of that obviously has to be done, right? Because you got all these bridges, right, that don't work well. And you can go to the American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCE. Look at their website. It's a little bit hard to find this stuff on the report card, but you can find the report card if you keep plugging away. So they want to renovate the old stuff, and not the new construction. Now, our approach, of course, is very different. We want great projects. We want things that are big, like the Transcontinental Railway, right? Like some equivalent of the Panama Canal, right? Something that's really going to change the world economy and something that's going to change people's everyday lives. And there are all sorts of ways to do that. We do have that list of 50 projects, right, which we discussed on the weekday show, and those are good, but that's not what's being talked about now. They want shovel ready. So the idea is that governors have been told 90 days for you to start your building projects, right? And again, it's all fine, but not if it comes out with some Wall Street speculator owning the freeway and being able to slap tolls on you. So this is problematic. And of course, the idea is also that the Republican Congress is not going to vote for this. That's the other little problem that we have. Washington Post on Thursday, quick action on Trump's infrastructure plan is unlikely, despite his meeting on Tuesday with Richard Trumka of the AFL-CIO. It's not likely that Ryan or Mitch McConnell will be impressed by that. As a matter of fact, Mitch McConnell, as we've reported, says all of this has to be delayed until next year. The one guy who did talk a lot about this was Limbaugh this week. I got the impression that Limbaugh wanted to talk about infrastructure as happy talk, right? Singing tomorrows, rather than talking about the grim reality that a lot of his audience are going to have trouble keeping their health care under the various changes that are being brought in. So that's the infrastructure story, at least to a significant amount. Now, in terms of economics and finance, remember, March 15th, we go back to the infamous and destructive debt ceiling. Today's the 10th. By the time you hear this, it'll be the 11th. So it means that next week, on Wednesday, it'll be the Ides of March. So think about poor old Julius Caesar and realize that some of us may be in the same boat in terms of the debt ceiling. The U.S. government may be in the same boat. So we have Steve Mnuchin of Goldman Sachs, late of Goldman Sachs, now of the Treasury Department. He has written a letter. Mnuchin has sent a letter to Ryan, to Speaker Ryan. And he says, "Dear Ryan," in effect, "you should please lift the debt ceiling at the first opportunity." And I think it means raise it. Although, remember, the argument here is that it does not exist and it cannot exist. It is unconstitutional. It is ruled out by the fourth clause of the 14th Amendment, which says the public debt of the United States contracted according to law shall not be questioned. That, my dear friend Miller, is the thing that shall not be questioned. You've got to pay the bills. Don't talk about canceling, defaulting, refinancing, haircuts, or any of that stuff. No, not the U.S., not now, because this would, of course, trigger a complete worldwide chaos and depression. So Mnuchin writes to Ryan, and he says, "Dear Ryan, we are suspending the sale of certain state and local securities that they do in connection with tax money management. They are about, at the Treasury, they're going to suspend payments on certain federal government pension funds because they want to delay the moment when they can't pay." Clear. Mnuchin writes, "As I said in my confirmation hearing, honoring the full faith and credit of our outstanding debt is a critical commitment. I encourage Congress to raise the debt limit at the first opportunity so we can proceed with our joint priorities." So this, of course, means all this stuff, Social Security, what have you. The thinking is that if the Treasury, which I do not know, I haven't checked lately, but the word has been in the recent past that the Treasury has about $200 billion cash on hand. Let's see what the Washington Post of today says. Budget experts think that if the debt ceiling is not raised by August or September, the Treasury will run out of steps or measures to delay default, and the government could fall behind on its obligations. And at that point, they get into this thing of allocating the money they have to certain things and not paying others. This is a recipe for disaster. We'll just add a couple of points to this when we return after the break. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio here on the 10th of March as we're recording in Washington, D.C. Now, what happens if you think you're going to run out of money? And this could come soon. This article says August or September. Others say June. So let's see what happens. There could be the attempt to present a clean bill and raise the debt ceiling. But, as the Washington Post says, that could be difficult because many lawmakers find it politically poisonous to approve the debt without changing spending or tax practices. So we're back to the usual Republican blackmail and extortion. We're going to bankrupt the country unless you allow us to cut programs that our sugar daddies and angels don't like. That's one. Another possibility is a debt limit increase attached to another bill, a rider, and that other bill has got enough support so it will pass. Or, this is the most suicidal, they could decide to raise or suspend the debt limit, which has never been done. Well, it has been suspended. If that happens, of course, for a long time there was no debt limit, you dolts. If that happens, the Treasury officials could be forced to decide whether to prioritize payments and stop paying certain bills. The problem with that is anybody will tell you, if you default on one thing, you've defaulted on everything. And the credit agencies will see that if you're defaulting over here, you have defaulted. And they will be merciless, right? And that will be the end of your credit rating, right? It's already gone down from AAA to AA, at least for one of the companies, and it will continue. So this absolute insanity. The only responsible path, assuming that the extremists, the right-wing extremist Republicans in the House in particular, will not vote for this, and that the craven leadership there in the House, the Speaker, will not force their hand and rely on Democratic votes, because it can be done. The only way then is for the President, acting under the Constitution, to say, okay, having looked at the 14th Amendment, Mnuchin, organize a Treasury auction, get the money we need, pay the debts. Insolvency is illegal, bankruptcy is illegal, default is illegal, and people who do not deliver the goods in that area will regret it. Now, we've also got to talk about military strategy, and in particular, we need to talk about the THAAD missile system, right? The Theater, High Altitude Area Defense. And the interesting thing this week is that some first components of a THAAD battery or batteries have arrived in South Korea, the Republic of Korea, the ROK, the Seoul government, which is a country that's having a bit of a rough time lately because they've just not only impeached, but they're removing their president for various kinds of malfeasance, which we can't get into. But that is the situation. Now, we also know that the Pyongyang regime, North Korea, the Kim family plantation, the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, they've done these ballistic missile tests now where they've practiced firing at least 4 medium-range ballistic missiles or short-range ballistic missiles. These are, in particular, enhanced Scuds, but with some improvements. And this is, of course, a drill. How do you overwhelm the existing Patriot missile defenses and pound the South Korean and U.S. forces along the demilitarized zone, right, according to that line of demarcation, which dates from the Korean War in 1953, ceasefire in place. Now, the Chinese government is vociferating that they don't like this. And they're saying, oh my God, this is going to lead to a arms race in Asia. The U.S. is interfering. The U.S. is meddling. And I would like to formally and solemnly reject such protests, right? There have been protests from Pyongyang, protests from Beijing, and there may have been some protests from Moscow too. I am afraid, because, you see Russia actually shares a border with North Korea, right? The town of Razin. But this is illegitimate. This is unjustified. In other words, the United States, acting on the invitation of South Korea, Republic of Korea, ROK, has every right to deploy this defensive system, THAAD. So the THAAD is a capable system. It can go up to, 100 kilometers, 150 kilometers. It's probably classified and so forth. So when you look at North Korea, I think you have to be blinded by anti-Americanism not to see that there is a serious problem of instability in the North Korean government. Now, we're on the lookout for instability where we find it, and we're not blind to the instability that can exist also here in the United States, right? We're aware of that. But the big point is we want war avoidance. This is not a war measure. This is a war avoidance measure. The THAAD is defensive. You can't use THAAD to attack a city or a military target, an air base. It's only for flying objects. And the way that it's going to work is to defend you from incoming missiles and or bombers or cruise missiles or other sorts of projectiles. So I'm sorry. The people in Russia and China and North Korea should mend their practice. And that it means convince the North Koreans not to conduct these drills, which are so obviously directed towards preparing what amounts to a sneak attack. Some fine day, right? They say, well, we've got 50 Scud missiles here. We're going to fire them all at once. Some of them will get shot down, but a lot of them won't. And if those hit U.S. air bases and South Korean air bases, then we can have a war. South Korea relies on the United States. U.S. has about 29,000 soldiers still in South Korea after the war ended in 1953. The missiles coming from the north are not necessarily significant, but they're a real threat. Now, the complaint coming from the critics of the U.S., because that's really what they are, they say this is a strike-enabling system. Now, I think this is a specious argument because it says what you're doing, if you want to put in THAAD, it means that you really want a first strike. You would like to have a first strike on these wonderful, peaceful countries, in this case, North Korea. But then you want to deprive them of their ability to retaliate. And then in order to whip up emotions, they mix this in with the Israeli Iron Dome system, right? That it prevents missiles from coming in. Well, the world would be more stable if the major powers, either singly or jointly, and that's always an interesting proposition, the major powers singly or jointly could and should install a capable anti-ballistic missile defense. This is one of the worst things that George W. Bush ever did, was to break out of the ABM treaty, which went against. So we are hoping, we recommend that the THAAD be installed, and the idea then being to convince North Korea that an attack is futile, that it will get them nowhere, and therefore they should cease and desist and simply accept the status quo. We've also had some other diplomatic stuff. I'll just mention this in our final segment coming up. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Now we got to rush ahead. It's our last segment. The Russian government, of course, has now apparently, as far as I can tell, started to violate the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of the Reagan years, about 1987, I guess, the INF. They have got now a new cruise missile being deployed, not even tested, but deployed in Europe. So that's one of the few remaining arms control treaties. As I said, I just condemned George W. Bush for breaking out of the ABM treaty. That was a real shame. But the INF, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, the Russians are apparently disregarding that, even though they're signatories. As far as China is concerned, this idea of building these islands in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, the Spratly Islands and so forth, and then loading them with military equipment, this significantly undercuts any moral authority they might have in saying to the U.S., don't you dare deploy this essentially or exclusively really defensive weapon, because that's the missiles coming from Russia that are now in the Kaliningrad area, be it ballistic missiles and or these cruise missiles. Those are potentially attack weapons. Those are not exclusively defensive. And then as far as the Chinese are concerned, right, simply saying we extend our territorial waters 750 miles in a southeasterly direction. That is an unfriendly act. That is an aggressive act. So I would urge the various virtuosi of anti-Americanism to look at some of that stuff and start asking yourself, maybe your prejudices are out of date. Maybe they're obsolete. And maybe there really is a problem here, a crisis where the U.S. is not automatically the villain. And, of course, we don't want confrontation. We want to avoid confrontation because we can have no confidence that the current U.S. leadership would be able to handle this wisely. In other words, the current setup would not be like John F. Kennedy in October of 1962. It would be more like Dean Acheson saying, blow them up, or somebody like Curtis LeMay in that same crisis. Now then, ideology. And that is to say the ideology of the White House. Now remember, at the CPAC conference, we had Steve Bannon, the resident ideologue of the White House, coming forward and say that there are three baskets or verticals. Now, when he says verticals, that is Putin speak. The idea of verticals of power, you can look that up online, right? Look up verticals of power when Putin. It is a way of having a kind of top-down control, centralized control over all sorts of areas of society by having your essentially power lines, right, that are transmission belts for orders from the top. So Bannon is apparently talking in this, what can we say, fundamentally not typically, U.S. traditional vocabulary. And he says the three big points are sovereignty. Sovereignty for him means breaking up NATO, breaking up the United Nations, trying to break up the European Union. Sovereignty. That's his view of sovereignty. Economic nationalism, which is essentially avoiding, and this has some merit, right, getting out of these free trade deals, but there's no positive conception there. And then the deconstruction of the administrative state. Now, the Washington Post of today focuses on a number of expressions, right? America first. This is Lindbergh, 1940, meaning don't intervene in Europe, let Germany do what they want. The enemy of the people. I think this is more like the Jacobin of the French Revolution. Corporatist. This is not the original Italian Mussolini version of corporatist. This is essentially a more modern version, which is essentially says that you're a small group and you want to impose your interest on the rest of society. Fake news. Well, this has pedigree going back to the 30s. Economic nationalism. And again, it's usually not nationalism. It's usually nativism, globalist, and radical Islamic terrorism. So these are the buzzwords. These are the shibboleths. And here we have Congressman Tom Cole of Oklahoma, who apparently was a historian. He taught history at the University of Oklahoma before he went into politics. He says, this is populist rhetoric. It's so systemic, it's hard to believe it's not a deliberate effort to change the language of politics. Bannon, as we reported when he did this, he condemned the corporatist, globalist media, says there's a global power structure, and as we said, he wants the deconstruction of the administrative state. And there's a great fetish around the magic words of radical Islamic terrorism, even though this is controversial inside the White House itself. Not always for good reasons, right? Because some people want to mobilize those people for their own use. But you can see this is now, it's a new ideological climate. Now, the Washington Post, as far as I can see, seems to be talking to Bannon. I don't know, but as of today, Friday, they're talking here they talked to Newt Gingrich, that this is a genuine change. It's an assertive language and a focus on America that cuts against the norm of the language of the past 30 years. That is the point, says a senior administration official who spoke on the condition of anonymity, because, quote, the terminology of the movement is something for historians to look back on and analyze. It's a little strange to talk about it in real time. Now, who could that be? Well, it could be any number of people. It could be Bannon. It could be Miller. It could be Gorka. It could be another guy called Anton, last name. But let's see where some of this stuff actually comes from. Right? Is this really something new? How about the question of the deconstruction of the administrative state? What kind of verbiage is this? Well, I recommend people take a look at Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt was, of course, from one point of view, a leading German jurist, legal theorist of the 1920s and 1930s. He's the guy who wrote the emergency power, the state of siege, state of war, martial law provisions of the Weimar Constitution. And what Carl Schmitt then did during the 1920s especially was to campaign to try to bring about a dictatorship under those emergency provisions of the president of the Reich, whoever that was, right? It was Friedrich Ebert for a while. It was General von Hindenburg for a while. And eventually he got what he wanted, because this is what was then used in 1933. So Carl Schmitt, for example, if the current slogan is the deconstruction